Welcome to LibertyDad podcast, where we prepare for tomorrow's political conversation by how we engage today. This episode, I'm interviewing Dave Benner for the LNC Region 2 rep role. These interviews are intended to be a little on the tough side, and by tough, I don't mean hostile, but the candidates will be put in the hot seat. Now, why would I do that? I feel interviews are often either too soft or too hostile. They focus on what we like or dislike about a person, rather than whether they can communicate their fitness for a role. These interviews are intended to be a little tough so that each candidate later walks away and says, man, I should have said this. Word of caution though, just because someone doesn't have an answer or gives them what you think is an underwhelming one, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are not the right fit for the job. It just means they weren't prepared to answer the question at the time, and hopefully the next time they will be. The goal here isn't to embarrass people or give them a tough interview such that it leads people to believe that they aren't ready for the role. It's simply to raise the bar with our expectations of leadership and how we interview, starting with communication. With that, let's dive right in and hear from Dave. Dave, how are you?
Thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate you giving me the time to talk about my campaign.
Awesome. Well, I am glad that you made it here, and we're going to get right into it. So people don't know this, but I met Dave at the what was it, the Georgia convention. I met you at the Georgia convention, and he handed me his resume. Okay. So I was pretty impressed. I was like, wow, he's like got a whole flyer like listed. It looks kind of like a resume for the job. So there was a lot here to work with because I wasn't terribly familiar with you necessarily. Sometimes once we get outside of Florida, it's kind of a hit or a miss on how much I know about a person. So it can be kind of hard to start thinking of like, all right, what should I ask them and whatnot. But let's go ahead and get started. So let's talk about who you are. So just kind of introduce yourself and tell us who you are.
Sure. I'm Dave Benner. I actually did meet you in 2020 at the Orlando National Convention
Oh,
for a
yes,
small
yes.
period, but fair enough. It was good to see you in Georgia as well. Yeah, but I've essentially been a libertarian philosophically since 2004. I stumbled upon the philosophy almost by chance during a
Hmm.
college research project on central banking in the
Hmm.
US, and I stumbled upon Murray Rothbard's writings. So from there, I went down an epic rabbit hole, kind of associated with my local affiliate in the Libertarian Party of Wisconsin in
Hmm.
2004. I'm a recovered neocon, embarrassingly so. I used to champion overseas wars all the time, and it's absolutely embarrassing now to look back upon it. I consider myself a child of the Ron Paul Revolution,
Hmm.
absolute fanatic of him, think he was the best steward of our beliefs in our time. And I did leave the LP for a period of several years, from 2008 to the mid 2010s.
Okay.
Won't get into that right now unless you ask me about it later. Would be happy to delve deeper, but I've been involved in the LP Minnesota and LP Tennessee since. Right now, I currently serve as the director of communications for the Tennessee Party.
Hmm.
So I, with the help of one other person, run our Twitter account. I run our Facebook almost exclusively, and I direct people within the state to help with press releases, how we market our candidates, and things like that. And just beside that, I have contributed to the 10th Amendment Center liberty-oriented history content for
Hmm.
about 10 years and the Mises Institute about 5 years. So that's kind of a roundup of who I am, I guess, in the party. If I have a pet issue that is close to my heart, it's political decentralization,
Hmm.
so nullification and secession. And yeah, that's where I'll stop, I guess.
Okay. So I am given to understand, tell me if I'm wrong, but you're a bit of a historian. Is that what you are or do?
Yeah, I'm an amateur historian. It's my
Okay.
absolute passion. It's not what I professionally do. I am a business analyst at a financial advisory firm, but in this struggle that we have against the state for liberty, I view my role as that of a messenger and educator. And we can't correct the future evils that the state gives us without looking at ways in the past that they've been confronted and overcome. So I really think
Gotcha.
that's valuable.
Gotcha. So what I heard was nerd by day, nerd by night.
Yes, in so many words, I'll admit that.
That's awesome. It's funny. I try to, I think when I was in high school, well, I don't even think I know this for a fact. When I was in high school, I was really averse to history. I just was like, oh, this is boring, it's terrible, blah, blah, blah. It's just, and then as I got older, and I think especially when I started getting more into politics and paying more attention to politics, I started realizing the value of history, not necessarily just, the Romans and, back in those times, but maybe even just a couple of years ago. Yeah, just history in general, because I've noticed that history repeats itself. And I don't mean like the grand things. Like people tend to think of like, oh, like if we're not careful, we're going to have like a second, third Reich rise up. And maybe that's so, right? But I think people often forget the smaller elements of history that repeat themselves. And sometimes I notice that I'll be commenting on something and I'll remember something from 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm like, you know what? And then I'll realize that that just knowing it really impacts how I see a current event. And we're talking about stuff that's, historical in my lifetime, not necessarily prior to me. So I appreciate people that can really dive into the history. I know you just recently had a book come out, I think, about Thomas Paine. Is that correct?
I just finished the manuscript for it. Thanks for asking about that. That'll probably be released by around Thanksgiving.
Okay.
Don't typically promote that at the same time as my work for the LP because it's a little bit tangential to that. But I am passionate about Paine, and I think his methodology proves some of the things that we want to do as a party. So,
Right.
yeah, happy to get that out there. It should be out by the end of the year.
Awesome. Well, look out for that, everybody, when you're, in the future, look out and say, hey, let me check this out, because, hey, it's always good when we have members of the party that are contributing to disciplines out in the world, right? Making contributions. I think that's a good thing. It shouldn't just all be, getting in the party and necessarily just only doing party business. I think that if we're doing something, then, and it's noteworthy, we should kind of celebrate it. I don't care if it's, maybe a painter or a historian or, a doctor, a lawyer, or what have you. Like if you're doing something out there that kind of contributes and can make the party look good in any way, then I think we should kind of give ourselves a pat on the back and encourage it. So. But okay, so let's talk about your roles here real quick that you already do in Tennessee. You got the communications director, and I think you're on the judicial committee too, as well, right?
I was, and then I just stepped down from that by the
Okay.
time of our most recent convention. So at the time that I
Okay.
gave you the flyer, that was true, but now it is not.
Okay, fair enough. So in the communications, you're responsible for primarily for Twitter and then exclusively for Facebook. So tell me your strategy for communicating liberty at the state level through those two social mediums.
Yeah, so at the state level, we want to message on the biggest issues of our days that
Mhm.
that we think are ruining people's lives. So in general, in the last 8 months, maybe 10 months since I took over as the director of May last year, so almost a year.
Mhm.
We've really focused on an anti-lockdown message that we felt was missing from the National Party.
Mhm.
I think the LNC essentially ignored that issue for about a year,
Okay.
did not publish an email toward members for a year on that issue. And also right now, the militarization of Eastern Europe, certainly in the news, that is something we are taking a big stand on. But strategic wise, we want to get to the heart of our platform in clever ways, right?
Okay.
We don't want to mimic like the talking points of the left and the right, even sometimes when we would agree on those talking points.
Mhm.
We want to kind of be looking overhead like on a mountain as wise libertarians looking down at this duopoly that has run people into the ground, destroyed their lives, made so many difficulties for the average person. So we really believe in a messaging style that isn't milquetoast, that really gets to the heart of our platform in clever and radical ways and does it uniquely. So we also really, really, really believe in response tweets and response messages,
Okay.
because that's the way to get our party a lot of exposure, especially on Twitter, where it's helped us get a lot of exposure where we otherwise wouldn't. As far as internally, we do want to promote our candidates and local level issues they're working on in their communities. Right now, we have basically a industrial hemp bill, and we just kind of had a loss in the state house in regard to ballot access. It did make it to a floor vote and failed. So we want to message to those things, build our candidates up, but really message to national issues too.
Okay. So when you Do you have a lot of candidates that are running in your state, like just local level?
Yeah, absolutely. We do. Well, I guess it's relative, right? But I
Sure.
think we have at least 11 candidates.
Okay.
We have LaMichael Wilson running for governor. Really excited to support him. Dave Jones, our state chair, running for U.S. Congress. We have a few people running for state level offices. Nick Salwell, one of our state House districts.
He was here in Jacksonville speaking at
Oh,
Eric Parker's event just a week ago.
great. Yeah. And I got to meet Eric and Tracy Robinson too. Love those guys. The
Hmm.
Jacksonville City Council has some great people running for it. We
Right.
have really good regional candidates. Georgia does too. Shane Hazel, Angela Pence,
Hmm.
Ken Pauline. There's a lot of people, but we're proud to be part of that in Tennessee. Would love to see more candidates, but I'm excited to promote them too.
Gotcha. And so I know one of the complaints, and we're not going to dive into I'm not going to give my opinion on the legitimacy of it, but one of the complaints that we have here in Florida is that the state level tends to forget about the local candidates. Or it's usually a more generic complaint, like, hey, they're not giving us support. So it's not always clear exactly what that means. Does that mean like retweets? Does that mean promoting us on your website? Does that mean donating party funds? Does that mean trying to find training? Like it varies depending on who you talk to. Is that same complaint? Is that a complaint that you're familiar with in Tennessee? Do local level party members kind of make that same complaint?
I think I haven't really heard it like very articulated to a very common extent, but I have heard that traditionally. I've heard that about the Mises Caucus at times, things like that.
Hmm.
So yeah, and I have a position on that too. Do you want me to elaborate?
Sure, absolutely. 'Cause, I mean, I'll get to
Yeah,
it, but if you don't, or I'll try at
sure.
least if I remember.
Sure. Yeah, I think I mean, it can be legitimate. I think a
Hmm.
lot of our candidates, especially on the campaign trail, could use a lot of more social media exposure. Sometimes historically, from what I found, campaigns that are run by candidates, like they have to take almost everything upon themselves to do everything. I want to try to take as much of at least the messaging burden that I can with my limited time and resources off of them. So I'm willing to give them, direct lines to me, point me to everything you want me to retweet, get out there,
Okay.
etc. As far as funding, yeah, I think that the states could devote more money to candidates at times. I know in Tennessee, I don't think that funds this year have been allocated to our candidates yet. I'm not saying they won't be. I'm not part of the board, but I think that our board has interest in that. But
Gotcha.
really, I think one of the biggest complaints is once they actually get into office, like what now? To support them.
Mm.
What my idea for the LNC is to have what I'm calling a resolution repository, where there's a central location with all sorts of model legislation and
Okay.
resolutions that they can introduce from the ground without having to do their own research work, going to this pack, going to this think tank to get model legislation. They have it like in one location. That's my idea.
Gotcha.
So I think the qualm is legitimate, but I also believe in division of labor, even
Hmm.
within the party, right?
Right.
So those that are best at messaging and getting our philosophy out there should concentrate in that. Those that are best at managing campaigns should concentrate on that. And oftentimes what happens is many people, some people take many different roles that they're not
Hmm.
necessarily suited for because of the smallness of our organization. I
Right.
want to try to disrupt that as much as I can within the reason of getting stuff done nonetheless.
Gotcha. Um, would you, and I know this isn't necessarily your decision to make, but would you support the idea that, hey, if we're going to offer all these things to candidates, um, that there needs to be some quality level, whatever that means, but like you've got to meet this level of quality as a candidate in order to receive, you know, funding, to receive, the work that we're doing. And when I say receive it, I don't mean like, oh, you got in office, but you're not the caliber that we were looking for. So therefore, you don't get any of these resolutions. It's not really what I mean. I just mean like when somebody's like, hey, I would like to run for a candidate position, like, okay, here's what we expect. Here's what we'll give you. And, we'll do our best to provide you in return. Do you support that kind of an direction with candidates?
Yeah, I absolutely think that you have to have standards as
Hmm.
part of a party that calls itself the party of principle. We have to expect the candidates that run for us to uphold the principles. If they don't, it's not a successful vehicle for what we want to do. And I'm not saying that I'm the best one to develop those standards
Right.
or am in the seat of power where I would make those decisions personally, directly. But absolutely so. I would never support a candidate merely because of their party affiliation, even a
Right.
libertarian. So if
Sure.
just having an L next to your name, that's
Right.
not enough for me to want to give you financial or labor support. I want to know that you're grounded in our philosophy, our principles, self-ownership, non-aggression, and
Hmm.
private ownership of property. So
Gotcha. Yeah, and I was just thinking not necessarily the positions that one takes, because I think if it's a local level, there's a little bit more flexibility in some ways, because some issues just aren't going to come their way. Like our city council candidates, they will they will shy away from questions on abortion because they're like, I'm a city council candidate. Like, I don't need to be talking about this. I need to be talking about the things that city council here in Jacksonville is doing. And they're doing a lot. So there's not really a whole lot of room to necessarily talk about these other, like, hey, do you support everybody having fully automatic, machine guns? Well, yes, but I'm also city council. So that's not really that important. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, I guess technically some of these things, if you got them to a local level, maybe they could be important, right? But as it stands right now, many of these things are just not. And then also, I was kind of referring to, uh, the effort that they put in, and
mm,
like, hey, if you go everywhere and you're in flip flops and a t-shirt, and you're talking about running for, mayor, I don't know. I mean, if it's a beach town, I guess maybe, but I don't know. I feel like we should raise the bar a little bit and say no. Like, there's a time and a place for that, and you find that right time and place. So I was just curious where you stood on that.
yeah, yeah,
But
absolutely. Thanks for clarifying that too. Yeah, I agree that there should be standards there too. I'm not one to try to tell each individual candidate like
mhm,
how exactly strategically to run their
right,
campaign. I wouldn't even say that there's not a chance that wearing different kinds of attire in certain places would be better at connecting with people. So
right,
even on that, but yeah, I do believe in the standards of putting an effort to knock on doors, get the word
yep,
out, and
yep,
really to be our best messengers,
yeah,
because the candidates are at the forefront of carrying the torch of our message into
yeah,
a new future that we want to create in the absence of state authoritarianism.
right. I mean, if it's their job, like if that's the job that they really want, it's part of the job effectively to go knocking doors. So in theory, they should be talking to more people than pretty much anybody in the party, right? Because they're supposed to be going and knocking doors, try to get support. Hi, I'm so and so, right? So I feel like that kind of is in one way the first line of not defense, but maybe offense, I guess. Politically speaking. So, okay, that's interesting. And what else about your social media? Like you focus on you focus on more national topics. Um, Tell me about, so you've got here on your goals, ensure stronger, more radical oriented messaging from the national party on all libertarian issues. So I assume that's something that you already put into practice at the state level. So when you talk about stronger and radical oriented messaging, what does that mean? Describe what it is and tell me what it isn't.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I think I touched on it a little bit earlier, just a small amount, but it's essentially getting to the heart of our platform in
Hmm.
interesting, new, and clever ways.
Okay.
What I would liken to it is from like the messengers of our best past, Harry Brown and Ron Paul, what they said about the Fed, about gun ownership,
Hmm.
about the coercion of the state, about the welfare state, the tax apparatus, etc. That's the kind of messaging we want to replicate, because I think that there's no basically argument against the fact that our most radical messengers have also reached the most people. I
Okay.
think that, Ron Paul's revolution, though, it was fomented within the Republican Party, awakened a lot of people to our ideas that wouldn't have before. And I think we can do it again. There's a lot of politically dispossessed people out there.
Okay.
So yeah, getting to the heart of the platform and the statements of principles in clever ways, and absolutely stating the fullest extent of our principles. So,
Okay.
and we can do that both with supporting legislation in the state. So we can say we absolutely support this hemp legislation that will decriminalize hemp, but also say, well, we're for ending the drug war in its entirety. It's destructive and abominable. So I think that both aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but I err toward, getting to the root of our platform. What it isn't is it isn't degrading people. It isn't engaging in racism. It isn't any kind of collective judgment upon anyone except the state. I mean, I'm bigoted toward the state. I will say that.
Sure.
But it's but it's not.
See, now you got to be careful. Someone's going to clip that and just clip the part where you said I'm bigoted, right? And that's all they're going to play on Twitter now. So like, see, he totally admitted it.
It's not putting people down. It's lifting up the individual and to denying the omnipotency of the state.
Gotcha. So let's talk about the Ron Paul messaging, because I am not a Ron Paul libertarian. And what I mean by that is I was not familiar enough or paying attention to politics at the time. So I came into libertarianism just kind of as a gradual seeing things and learning things over time. There was no particular person that really got me invigorated about the libertarian message. In fact, during the time that Ron Paul was active in delivering that message, if you had said, man, did you hear that libertarian message from Ron Paul? I would have been like, who's that? Probably, right? Like, I mean, I just wasn't paying attention, even though I think I'm old enough to have been. I just wasn't. I was probably like high or drunk at that time, all the time. But anyway, so I often wonder, okay, so a lot of people have said the same thing. They're like, dude, what Ron Paul did, we can do again. And I like to think what got you here won't get you there. And I look and I say, yeah, that message was great. And maybe, and I've seen some of the videos where, he's radical and he's on fire, kind of brimstone, political brimstone, and then there are a lot of boos in the crowd, right? And he's standing firm and he's like, I'm not giving up. And then presumably people such as yourself and others who were Ron Paul libertarians, were the people that like, wow, this is a great message. And, he's standing up to the whole crowd and you got invigorated. So my question is it proper to assume that the world today is in a place where they would be receptive to that same style of messaging? Or do you think we need to be something a little different? And that his message, like if Ron Paul were literally transported from that time to this time, put on a stage, I kind of wonder how well it would actually work today. Because I'm like, I think we're in a different place just as a society. What do you think?
To answer your question, the world is not in that place, but I think the remnant is, the vanguard is that we want to create and, foster into libertarian warriors to send out against the state. I do think that it is ready for, the anti-Fed, anti-war, anti-tax messaging of Ron Paul. That is like the only way that we can kind of spread our message right now on a national level is through some of those same ideas, because we've thrown out candidates out there that kind of, it seems to me, are more concerned about triangulating to the left and the right and, representing our principles only to the extent that they think that they're making inroads, getting more votes. But I don't think that that's the right way for us nationally right now. I do think that the Ron Paul, Harry Brown, Spike Cohen, Dave Smith approach to messaging is better, because give me 1,000 lifelong liberty activists, over 10,000 presidential votes anytime. We are the best expositors of spreading this message as activists, and one-time votes that won't help you in the future have not paid dividends for us. So I do think that the remnant, the dispossessed, libertarians are ready for the more radical messaging right now. The world isn't, but it's our job to correct that the world isn't.
I got you. So the one-time votes, do you think there's no place for them? Well, no, that's not the way I want to phrase that question. I think there's always a place for a little bit of everything, right? But is it possible that the party could have been in a place where these one-time votes could have been turned into something more and we simply were not ready for it? Is that possible? And if so, what would that have looked like to turn those, those people who may not have been prepared to hear that radical message, they just maybe, for whatever reason, they said, I don't like this guy, I don't like that guy, so I guess I'll vote for this third party. All right, we got their attention for a brief moment. What do you think might have been the thing that would have caused them to go, let me stick around a little longer, see what's going on?
Yeah, I do think that it's reasonable to claim that there is a place at times to worry about one-term votes.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not my end game. So by
Okay.
example, what I'll say is, like, I know on the national level, if your candidate gets 5% of the popular vote, I think that gives you some sort of leeway in terms of ballot access and
Mm-hmm.
financial support, things like that. But also the debate commissions. If we got a candidate that cleared that threshold to get on a national debate, it would be extremely helpful. And it was helpful for Ross Perot when he did the same. The Libertarian candidate hasn't really been there from the party perspective before. So I do think that we could leverage that into something
Mm-hmm.
good, that, some of those people that aren't really ready to digest the whole red pill yet might, be able to get more exposed to us and explore it better by that. But I don't think that the corporate media is necessarily the end all be all either now, because of all the alternative media,
Right.
Tim Pool and Joe Rogan. A lot of
Liberty
people,
Dad.
not LibertyDad, there you go. But a lot of people, and it does break down by age group
Mm-hmm.
dynamics sometimes, but a lot of people just don't ingest what they see from the corporate media
Right.
again. So I am giving credence to that idea to some extent. I just don't think it's the most important thing. I'm sorry about the last part of your question. Maybe I didn't address that. Was there another aspect that I?
No, I was. So one of the things that I have been critical of the Libertarian Party, as I've kind of observed and watched, especially with the fighting, I feel like that there is a lot of opportunities that have been missed from all sides because they're too busy fighting rather than figuring out how to work with what you have right now. So you get like these one-term voters, and I'm like, all right, great. Now I know that not all of them, I'm not even going to say that most of them can be, you know, moved to a position of libertarianism, right? Even if it's a weaker one. I accept that. There's a reason that somebody's maybe, would be called a one-term voter. Um, but I think that there are some for which we have probably missed a great opportunity. And I think part of that is because it's fighting. And we'll get into it here in a little bit. But the biggest fight right now seems to be between, the Mises crowd and the non-Mises crowd. And I had this revelation, and tell me what you think about this, because this goes into messaging. So I think it's an appropriate question. We know that states like New Hampshire get some spicy stuff out. Kentucky kind of a little bit. They play it a little bit safer, but a little bit sometimes. But in regards to some of the New Hampshire tweets, which can be pretty radical, like pretty wild sometimes, I had this revelation, and I said, you know what? Shouldn't I, as a good messenger, be able to pivot on their message if I'm talking to somebody, and pivot in such a way that I can bring the conversation to where I need it to be? Because it's hard for me to defend some of their stuff because I'm not entirely certain where they're going, or I might just disagree with how they've delivered it. And when you disagree strongly, it becomes difficult to do anything with that, right? So now you've got this person who maybe is asking you about it, or you're talking about it. And so I started, maybe the problem is us, that we're not ready to pivot. And I apply that also to that infamous Joe Jorgensen tweet about anti-racism. And, people got all upset and they were like, oh, this is not what the message that we want. And I'm like, sometimes you don't really get a choice in the message that you want, because somebody's always giving a message that you may not particularly care for. So would you agree that we need to grow more so that we could take virtually any message and work with it?
Yes and no. I don't know about virtually any message, but I do agree in the context you're speaking of here. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we could turn, Joe Jorgensen's tweet into kind of, a panacea to address, criminal, the criminal, the justice system,
Right.
system of criminal justice, things like that. Even on like with like Black Lives Matter, like if you're Black Lives Matter and you're telling me that you are totally for the abolition of qualified immunity, I'm right there with you. And
Right.
we can leverage into single issues like that. As far as, swallowing all of critical race theory and stuff,
Oh yeah, yeah.
no,
No, no, no,
absolutely
no,
not. And we can
no.
pivot to those other things like
Right.
you said. So I don't know about virtually every message. I agree with you on New Hampshire. I love their messaging. Like
Right.
99% of their messaging I think is right on, and when it's good, it's really good. There have been
Right.
times where I've shook my head a few times, but overall, I think that they've done a good job. Kentucky, too. We'd like to
Mhm.
be mentioned with them in Tennessee,
Right.
Connecticut, Colorado, I think are all good Twitter accounts. But yeah, there are some times where you're not going to get the greatest message you want. I mean, we've set like some of us radicals in this party for 15 years have sat by not seeing the messaging that we really want. So,
Right.
I have my own messaging preferences, and I'm not a fan of some of the stuff I've seen from local affiliates, but at the
Right.
same time, it doesn't mean like, oh, I'm going to try to purge people from that affiliate or usurp their affiliate
Right.
status.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely.
And don't get me wrong, for anybody that's watching and maybe even for you as well, I'm not suggesting that any messaging is a-okay. I think that there are, like, let me give you an example that I would disagree with. And I would say, I don't know how to, I mean, I think you should be able to pivot on anything and move the conversation. That doesn't necessarily mean agree. So if somebody says like rent is theft, right? I wholly disagree with this. I don't think that in any way, at least from what I understand it's supposed to mean, I don't feel like it in any way embodies libertarianism. Okay. And I think shifting on that is harder because it almost lends a little credence to
Mm.
the idea. But I guess my criticism is more like I can spend a lot of my time arguing. Let's just say that I dislike the Tennessee tweets. Let's just say that. I don't. That's not the case. But let's just say I didn't. Um, I can spend my time arguing about how you should do it differently, or I can kind of have that conversation at a small scale, but then focus on, all right, well, this is what they're putting out. Let me see if I can work with this for the time being, and then, while I'm having that conversation of, come on, guys, like this isn't what we need. And that's kind of what I mean. I mean, I know there are some ideas where like, I just don't think that they fit in the libertarian sphere. But I just feel like I don't want to be locked down or feel locked down from somebody else's message. So I'm just, curious if you can get on board with that and say, okay, or maybe not. Maybe you might say, you know what, DL, no, there are some ideas that they should never be presented, and we should never have to try to pivot on them either. And that's fair
Yeah,
too.
a little bit of both, but
Okay.
in the way you explained it, absolutely, I'm on board. I think you put it perfectly, because I think there is a tendency among some people to focus more indignation toward internal party factions than
Right.
actually the real enemy, which is out there, the state, destroying people's lives. So
Right.
to that, we can cheers, and I'm right
Sure.
there with you.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's move on. Let's talk about your LNC Region 2 role that you're running for. So let's see. Region 2 is Tennessee, and I think there's two other states, correct? Okay.
Georgia, Tennessee, and Florida, Sunshine State, Volunteer State, and Peach State. So
Okay. Now I'm
yeah.
going to look ignorant because here I am in Florida and I don't even know my own Region 2 rep. I'm not sure why I was thinking it was some other region. I don't know. Okay. I'm just going to say that it's Sunday and I've got a lot on my mind. We're going to go with that excuse. So we'll go with that one. Okay. So you got these three states. And what is the overall? So I've got your goals here, but overall, you get put into that role. And what do you want us as members of this region, to know that you accomplished? Like, what's the biggest win for you?
I guess the biggest end game for me would be to have the membership's confidence in that I represented the region well. Not
Okay.
that I told the region what to do, not that I told the individual state affiliates within our region to do, not that, anything to that, but that I represented our views in kind of our prioritization of issues, strategy, judgments to bring forward to the LNC, that I
Hmm.
represented that well, that I took feedback even when I disagreed,
Hmm.
and that I still represented the region with confidence and candor that our region deserves.
Okay. Um, let's be more specific. So what kind of, because we've got some things here, and
Sure.
so let's see, you've got um, I'm trying to read these through and just kind of, summarize them without reading them, entirely off, entirely through. So I know you talked about greater opposition to the lockdowns, and then so you've got messaging and so messaging will be one of them. So I tell you what, let's do it this way. We kind of have an idea of where you are. You're a member of the Mises Caucus, so that kind of gives us an idea of what you mean when you say, more radical messaging. You've listed it out here. You said, look, I want to I want to have a stronger opposition, vocally be more vocal against the lockdown state and the COVID regime. And then you want to you mentioned the model legislation resolution database, which, by the way, that is an absolute awesome idea. I really like that, if I understand it. So like at the state level, if we had a state representative, they could just go into the database and say, okay, here are some issues and here are some generic starter kits for resolutions or for legislation that I can draft and submit, so that they don't have to do it all. And then they can just adjust it as needed, as things change on the political landscape. So I think that's like super fabulous. And I personally believe that's how the big two do it, because otherwise they can't come out with like 1,000-page legislation that just conveniently is, for this moment in time. And I'm like, okay, that seems crazy. So to be more specific, it seems like most of it here is somewhere between uh, legislation and messaging. I got that right?
That's a lot of it. I also am big on single issue coalitions. So I
Okay.
think that this party in general at a national level needs to do better at allying with organizations, even if we disagree on 90% of the thing, on the 10% of the issue that we do agree with. Like examples are like the ACLU. There's a lot of things that the ACLU are doing that are really good to protect privacy, to oppose the drug war, things like that in time. So there is a lot of ways that we can unite on single issues where we don't necessarily coalition on the basis of party all the time. Sometimes it's on an issue basis. So I want to push that forward too, and
Okay.
I'm used to doing that from my work in the 10th Amendment Center, and I think it can be applied from a party perspective too.
So what are you doing, or what have you done, or what will you do, whichever one is most applicable, to reach out to the non-Mises crowd in order to reach them, or I'm not reach them, but represent them?
Yes,
What do
yeah.
we got there? Tell me.
I think, friendliness, just come up to them, meet them, hear out their concerns.
Hmm.
My inbox is going to be an open door for anyone to express feedback. Stephen Nicalia was when he was the rep, and
Hmm.
sometimes there were a few times that I disagreed to some extent on some of what he was trying to do. Mostly, I did agree almost wholly with Stephen, and glad to have his endorsement. But for those that don't agree with me, I'm going to take your feedback in mind, and I'm going to take it under consideration when casting my vote. I won't promise that I'll always vote the way you want, but I
Okay.
absolutely will hear you out with an open mind, an open heart. As far as tapping into that, I recognize that there's many people that prioritize issues better than me, local level campaigns, things like that. I want to
Hmm.
hear their thoughts on that, so we can try to represent the region for what I think it is, but also take into account dissenting voices. So I'm willing to meet people where they are, hear them out, incorporate that to some extent. Won't promise it in the form of vote unless I think that the region is in its entirety on board with that perspective.
Gotcha. Is there a time that has already happened where you were going to go in one direction, and I really hate using these terms, but bear with me because it's just the way that we've got to work it. You were going in a more Mises oriented direction, and you heard some dissent, and you said, you know what? I think you might be right. And in some way, you altered your direction, whether it was slightly or entirely. Has that happened so far?
The biggest thing I can think of is just who to support for vice chair. I think
Okay.
many within the caucus are split on this issue.
Hmm.
And, I feel strongly in that I'm supporting Josh Smith, even though many of the top board members and activists and state organizers in the party are going to go in a different direction,
Right.
like Eric Raudsep. So that's an example where, I have the utmost respect for people like Michael Heiss and Angela McArdle, but we don't
Right.
agree on that. And that's fine. So yeah, I think that's one, but that is not maybe the biggest issue.
Okay.
One of them is that in the wake of the New Hampshire usurpation, the attempted
Hmm.
seizure of that state affiliate by Joletta Jarvis, probably spurred on by the email written by Joe Bishop Henchman. In that case, in the fallout of that, there was a lot of drive to do an investigatory committee.
Okay.
And I supported that, but in the way it was originally conceived of, I ended up not being for it because I was for an outside firm handling that investigatory committee completely. And at first, kind of, I was going in the direction of, letting the party handle this. They're more suited to knowing the culture and the
Hmm.
players and stuff like that. But, when I heard from Spike Cohen addressing why he thought that, an external committee would be better, I ended up being inclined toward that position. So I guess that's another thing I'll cite. Other than that, not much comes to mind, but yeah.
Yeah, because what I feel has happened is there's a lot of members of the Mises Caucus that are rising up in the ranks, right? And what I'm not hearing a lot of, and I'm not saying it's not happening, I'm just saying I haven't really heard a lot of it, is where that person or people on their behalf are saying, this is when this person who was more Mises oriented kind of stopped, heard what I had to say, and said, you know what, and kind of went against the grain. And in your first example, that was more like going against the grain in the Mises crowd,
Hmm.
because I like Josh Smith. He's a good guy, but he's not necessarily the pick for the non-Mises crowd either.
Hmm.
Right. So it's not like the non-Mises crowd had an influence there in that particular choice. That's
Hmm.
just kind of saying like, I'll go against, it, yeah, I'm splitting on in the Mises crowd itself, you
Yeah,
know?
you're right. You're right about that.
And so I want to make sure that it's not that I feel represented fine, right? I think that there are others who are not. And what I want to hear is, what are we doing to hear them? And I know it can be incredibly difficult right now because everybody is at war with each other, right? So it's like, people are just fighting. And when there's so much fighting, there's not a lot of talking and not a lot of coalition building and all that going on. So I'm just trying to, get a sense of what it is that you've done, or maybe you have some plans. Maybe you're like, look, as soon as I get here, I'm going to do this. And if you don't have an answer now, that's fine. It's good. It's good. Like I said at the very beginning, it's just about stimulating that thought and having some different ideas.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I want to get out there on the LP internal kind of activist Facebook
mhm.
groups and just articulate why I voted the way I did to some extent, almost like Justin Amash did in
Okay.
his early years in Congress. And from that, let it be known that I have an open door for feedback, whether on phone or on IM. I'll be accessible. I work from home. I can usually respond to people in a pretty timely manner too. So, they will be heard.
Mhm.
I can't promise that I'll always like agree and then, vote that perspective. I still have to represent the region,
Right.
but I will open the doors for people to be heard that don't agree with me.
Okay. So let me ask you a question. If you get the feeling that the region wants to go in direction A, but you are pretty firm on direction B is the right one, how are you voting?
I'll vote to go on the region. If I'm convinced that I don't have the position of our region, I will vote with the region.
Okay.
I do think that my values and priorities are pretty well aligned with the region, but in
Okay.
that case, I would vote against my own intuition. And in some cases,
Okay. Fair enough. I mean, yes, and I don't mean to lock you in on anything, because I know that there could be like, like we could come up with the extreme scenario of like, what if we wanted to make capital punishment and everybody in the region said capital punishment was going to be on the platform? Would you like? No, I'm excluding those really odd, crazy scenarios, right? So please, anybody watching, don't think that. That's not what I'm getting at. Okay, cool. So tell me about this secret LNC business list and the votes that are taken.
Yeah, so right now, the LNC has two Google lists. One
Hmm.
is transparent for all party members to see on Google. That's where all the LNC members take votes and such when they aren't in an actual kind of teleconference or in-person meeting. That's existed for a long time. I've actually read every message for 8 years there. Call me a
Wow.
masochist. It's how I followed, the national party.
Right.
But there's another list, and there is some legitimacy for this in the bylaws. The bylaws confine certain matters to what they call executive committee
Hmm.
in the national party, and that's things that would lead us to potential legal liability if we divulge them to people. Some things like staff salaries and stuff have to be kept there, but from people that I know on the LNC, this list is being abused. It's being used for things that don't involve the things that are clearly articulated in the bylaws for reasons to have it there. So I want to put a stop to its excesses. I don't think it needs to be abolished entirely, but it's being used for inappropriate things. And I'm behind Erin Adams' motion that she raised about a month ago. Don't always agree with Erin, but I think it was a good idea to divulge many of the things from that list that are under this umbrella that they didn't really qualify for what the bylaws said they would. So it's just all in the overall interest, DL, of better transparency from the national party. I want there to be nothing in like really backroom deals, and backroom like concealment of data. Let's just be upfront with everything we decide.
Okay. All right. That sounds fair. Let's see if there's anything else here well, is there anything in your goals that you want to talk about that we haven't discussed yet?
Yeah, so maybe this has been probably the most controversial thing in the last 6 months in the LP is affiliate usurpations and purges.
Hmm.
My position on that is that the bylaws gives the national party the power in many places in the bylaws to acknowledge who the rightful board is.
Okay.
Certainly overtly in some cases, it's how we determine who to give like CRM access to. It's how we know about contacts for the national party to get a hold of for joint national and state level initiatives,
Hmm.
protests, etc. So that is absolutely clear. I don't want the national party to interfere in the actual decision-making process on an affiliate level, but the national party does have to declare who the rightful authority is. And this has been muddled. I mean, the national party this last few months and before the JC ruling had essentially said that this usurper in Delaware had the same standing as the rightful elected board, and I just don't think that was the case. In Massachusetts right now, their party enacted a large-scale purge of certain members that dared to sign a petition calling for a special convention. And again, those aren't my direct issues; those are
Hmm.
different affiliates.
Right.
But the LNC has to determine who the rightful elected board is out of those contentious situations. We don't have to tell them their board was right or wrong, but we have to acknowledge that. So I really feel strongly about that.
And we're coming up to the election. Not the election, but I mean the national convention. And to me, that kind of makes it kind of important because who do we credential, right, as delegates? And I think that makes it in some cases kind of critical because there is a timeline that's involved. Clearly, we need to figure out who to credential at least by the first day, right? Probably sooner than that. Um, but if we didn't have a national convention, let's just say it's 6 months, 6 months from now. So, but maybe 8 months from now. Let's go with 8 months from now. There's some shenanigan in some state. Are you of the position that in some cases it's better to wait it out? Or do you apply this standard of, hey, the CRM access and all these different places that suggest that we have this authority to decide who is the rightful delegate? Do you use that sooner than later, or do you kind of like tell me your position in 8 months when we don't have a national convention coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. It's better to, take a firm step on this sooner rather than later. I know in right now's case, our national convention is only in a month and a half away, but and so the delegates at that convention can always reverse what the LNC decides as far as credentialing. I mean, that will come up in
Hmm.
day one or maybe even day
Sure.
two of our national convention. But yeah,
Right.
absolutely. We have to allow people to have their connections to national be able to benefit them in the party. And we just can't wait, 8, 9 months, 10 months in some cases
Right.
to let these things be ironed out. The party has to take a stance on these things. So right now, I would absolutely have supported Rich Bowen's motion that was struck down by the chair for being out of order. I don't think that was out of order. I think actually, contrarily, the bylaws require that decision to be made. And that will come up in Reno. But yeah, sooner rather than later, we have to know who the rightful boards are to work with them and to get them the access and the resources that the National Party prides itself on.
Right.
So,
Okay. Well, I know we're getting close to our time, and I got two more questions. One is going to be based on leadership, and it's kind of along that Mises path again. And I'm going to get into why I'm kind of talking about Mises a lot. And then the other one is just a fun question, right? Just for funsie, right? Do grown men say funsie? I just did. I'll do what I want. So I know I keep talking about the Mises Caucus, and I'm doing that because you are now getting to, the LNC, and you're a region rep, and there are going to be a lot of non-Mises members. And right now it is a big source of contention in the party. And so I kind of want to get it from the lens of, there's a lot of people that they seem to present that the Mises Party or Mises Caucus is going to take over. It's going to become the Mises Party, and lots of purges are going to happen in some way. I disagree with that, okay? And I don't want to talk about that because I don't think that it's going to happen. I think that there's evidence already to the contrary, and that would be the very last national convention that we had, where on day one, there was a big fight in Orlando on the credentials. And everybody swore up and down that if we remove delegates from the credential, when we challenge the credentials, then they're just going to not reseat them and then move on to take over the party. And it didn't even come close to happening. In fact, I believe the vote to re-credential everybody after they did exactly what they said they were going to do was unanimous. Bring everybody back. And then their guy lost, right? Unfortunately, and I don't want to make a big deal of it. So in the spirit of talking about leadership and the Mises Caucus and criticism, is there criticism right now that you can think of that's fair of the Mises Caucus? And if there is, how might it be best resolved?
yeah, I think that the most prevalent criticism toward the Mises Caucus is that we don't focus on candidates. We don't want to elect candidates. And I think to some extent, but not to its fullest extent, that's true. So I do think people in the Mises Caucus do care about candidates, but that's not the sole thing we care about.
Okay.
In the Mises Caucus, we care a lot about single issue coalitions and messaging and actually non-compliance efforts. So taking the existing state apparatus and resisting that regardless of, electoral dynamics and bad electoral outcomes sometimes. So I think that criticism is at least partially fair. So I don't see elections as the end all be all purpose for the party. I think it's for setting the world free from the state. And I think that is clarified well in Article 2 of the bylaws. We enter into public information activities. So I think that criticism's partially fair, but not fully fair.
Gotcha. So does running candidates take a backseat to messaging?
No, I don't think the right way to look at it is what takes a back seat. It's, for me, it's
Or
engaging.
prioritize?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a multi-pronged approach, regardless of, how high in priority you see each of those things. I can see some cases where I would want to promote candidates more than, certain messaging tactics. Like if we produce a really hardcore radical presidential candidate, I will want to promote the hell out of that person compared to, say, taking a stance on, some niche issue that I don't feel is quite as important at the moment, but may be important in the long run still.
Okay.
So yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so it sounds like it's a case by case basis then.
It is, yeah,
Okay.
I would say.
So if it's like, hey, we got this candidate running for soil and water at a local level, then we might be busy doing some other things. But if you've got a good, strong candidate running for a governor position, then it may be, hey, we really need to get behind this person and, all hands on deck. and
Absolutely.
and
I
then
think
that's when you
pivoting is really
prioritize.
important.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's fair. Yeah, I don't think I think that's fair. I just wanted to, because I feel like what I hear is like sometimes it does feel to me that messaging is the reason for the caucus. Sometimes I don't think that's the case, but I could understand where somebody would say, "Man, all you guys want to do is just, you know, have at it at the Twitter account," and then they of course exaggerate and think that you just want to tweet, really mean stuff to people. And I don't think that's quite the case, but I can definitely see where, it almost feels like all you care about is messaging. And I'm like, well, we still are a political party, and we still have people doing a lot of footwork out there to try to run races. So, I was just wanted to get a sense of where you were with that.
Yeah, I do think that is one of the most critical parts of the party messaging at a national level. The state affiliates can handle almost everything else that this party does. So, yeah, I think it is a big part of it, and maybe an impetus for the caucus. I think in the past, Heiss and some others on the board have cited like they felt poor messaging, the elevation of people like Bill Weld to our highest candidacies and things like that, were some of the reasons they started the caucus. And I'm totally on board with that. I was
Mhm.
waiting for that kind of faction to develop with the LP for after so many years of being disappointed. So it is a big reason for it, but I don't think it's the end all be all. We want to inject political decentralization and Austrian economics, but it doesn't all have to be through messaging. It can be through human action. I mean, Ludwig von Mises was the biggest proponent of, that humans act out their interests, and allowing that to happen doesn't have to take the form of like a Twitter tweet. So
Gotcha. Okay, fair enough. All right, last question. This is the absurd one. So, bear with me. I'm a dad. My son is 3, and we've been watching a lot of Shrek lately. So, if you had to get into a fight, skip any libertarian principles for the moment. If you had to get into a fight, who would you rather fight? The Pied Piper or Rumpelstiltskin?
um man, I might just ruin this interview because I don't know who these are in the context of
Oh my
Shrek. I've never
goodness.
seen it.
Oh, you did not grow up. You grew up reading history, not fairy tales, huh? That's what it
Well, the
was.
fairy tales, yeah, but the Pied Piper, I know the reference to that, like in popular mythology, but are you talking specifically within Shrek or?
Well, just that's where I'm getting these characters from, right? And so the Pied Piper, of course, he played the pipe and took all the children away. And then Rumpelstiltskin, he was the one who would make deals with people. Well, he made a deal with the handmaiden about turning um, uh, not wheat, straw into gold, weaving straw into gold, and then made some deals. Basically, it started out with, "Hey, I'm going to make this deal, magical deal. I'm going to help you turn this straw into gold, and you give me your rings, your necklace, your this or that, whatever." And then when she ran out of stuff, but still needed to turn it into gold, she promised away her firstborn. And so then he came calling years later. And so it was a totally absurd question for that served absolutely no value whatsoever, but just to kind of leave on a little bit of a humorous note.
Yeah, I guess I'm all for the injection of more gold bullion into our
All right,
country.
there
So
we
I'll go
go.
with Rumpelstiltskin.
All
There you
right,
go.
so there it is. All right, everybody. So Dave Benner running for Region 2 representative. That's going to be Florida, of course. Like I knew that totally. Florida, Tennessee, and Georgia. So I hope you enjoyed the interview. Reach out to him. Dave, give you the last word before we close out. Tell people how they can reach out to you if they want to have an interview or just chit chat.
Yeah, first of all, thanks a ton, DL. It's great to kind of become your friend over the last few years. And to get in touch with me, I have a big presence on Facebook,
Mhm.
a little bit on Twitter, but reach out to me on Facebook, add me up, facebook.com/dbenner83. If you want to look at kind of my academic or educational things, go to www.davebenner.com. But any questions from anyone on our region, especially our delegates that will be in Reno, let me know. I'll be totally happy to answer your questions, even if they're adversarial. Let's go.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you, good sir. And that's going to be the end of the show for today.